I'm super excited about our first speaker today. And he is the CEO and co-founder of Chainpiracy, and I'm talking about Henry Ines. As the CEO and founder of Chainpiracy, a technology company focused on the development of blockchain applications and solutions for transparent and responsible supply chains. Henry serves on the steering committee of the GoChain Foundation, developer of the GoChain blockchain protocol, and is advisor to multiple tech startups. He has more than 20 years of professional experience as a management consultant, venture capitalist, corporate finance advisor, and tech entrepreneur. And he is passionate about leveraging cutting-edge technologies and innovative solutions for positive change and global impact. Henry, thank you so much for taking your time to share your experience and your wisdom with our global audience today. We're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jose. Much appreciate the invitation to be here this morning, and thanks so much to all of you for tuning in to Supply Chain Planning Live, and particularly for this session this morning. So, you know, as was mentioned during the introduction, obviously we've all been having quite a difficult past few years. Supply chains have really been tested. The resiliency has been tested. And, you know, in the pandemic and eventual post-pandemic environments, the path towards digitization has really accelerated, you know, given the circumstances that we've all been dealing with. So, and in particular, what we've seen, the adoption of novel technologies, particularly blockchain technology and distributed ledger technologies, that has really accelerated given its utility, particularly in the environment that we see ourselves today. So what I want to do this morning is basically talk about blockchain technology and how we can all start to prepare to incorporate this cutting edge technology into supply chains. In terms of the agenda, what we'd like to do is first, see if we can get this going here. Basically, begin by giving a primer on blockchain technology. The point of this is not to make everyone experts here. There's a lot to learn, but it's really about having the baseline to ask the right questions as we prepare to deploy blockchain technology. We'll learn about why this question is typically raised. Why blockchain technology? How does it differ from existing legacy solutions? We'll explore various cases related to blockchain and how it's being utilized in global supply chains. And then most important, we'll talk about some concrete steps that we can start to do as we prepare for rolling out blockchain. And if nothing else, just to remember a key takeaway that the technology is here, it is ready to be deployed today. Everything is about timing, especially with technology. There's a significant demand for it, and the economics and utility for it, it is ready to be deployed as long as your enterprise is willing to take the leadership to adopt the technology. So I'd like to begin by first just giving a very basic definition of blockchain technology. This is again just my view on it, and this as a just context as we move for the rest of the session. But you know, blockchain is really just a type of data structure. It's a distributed database, and if you think about this data structure, it consists of a chain of blocks. Okay, as the name implies. And within these blocks, you have cryptographically or highly secure time-stamped transactional data. Okay, and then these chain of blocks are essentially synchronized over multiple nodes and computing devices. So that's how I think about blockchain and how you can visualize it. And now let's talk a little bit more about it and what this really means. And I would say very important to underscore is that, because there's always a confusion, is that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, they are not blockchain technology, okay? So I want you to think about Bitcoin as an application that sits on top of the underlying technology, underlying protocol, which is blockchain technology, okay? So think about blockchain kind of like an operating system, the data structure, and then you've got various applications that run on top of it to include Bitcoin. This is really important because there's a lot of times it's conflated, and we really want to make sure that we separate the two. Now, very important as we talk about blockchain technology, as it's a data network, we're really talking about an evolution of where we're moving in terms of the type of data networks that we will rely on. So very much that we are accustomed to today are, in terms of a legacy solution, are just a centralized architecture. So if you talk about the work and the computing that's happening, it's centralized to a particular node, and so that node, it becomes a siloed network. Now, as you move more towards a decentralized network, you essentially have nodes that have subnodes, and those subnodes do some of the work that rolls up still into a centralized node. So you have a series of centralized nodes that communicate with each other, and those centralized nodes have subnodes. Now, when we move towards blockchain technology, now we're talking about a distributed network, and also decentralized in the sense of ownership of data. And when we talk about distributed, we're talking about a full equal peer-to-peer network. There are no subnodes. All the nodes are able to communicate with one another, and that's when we are saying that blockchain technology, it synchronizes all these transactions amongst these multiple distributed nodes with all equal access to data. And as I mentioned, legacy data through legacy centralized architectures, it's a siloed network. So these are opaque networks, which makes it sometimes very difficult to share. There's a lot of inefficiencies. And as a centralized structure, it is a single point of failure. So it's vulnerable and prone to mistakes, fraud, and of course, we all know this quite often, cyber attacks. And as you move towards the distributed blockchain technology structure, now it's decentralized. So no one, very important, there's no reliance on a trusted intermediary to access data. Everyone has access to that data. It's distributed, so you're talking about a distributed nodes, equal nodes, peer-to-peer nodes, and also globally distributed. The system is also fault tolerant because, so if a particular node gets compromised, it doesn't matter because all the other nodes maintain the entire chain of blocks, and it's highly, highly cryptographical secure, and very important, any transaction that gets posted on the blockchain is immutable or irreversible, so it makes it a very powerful auditing tool. And what you have essentially is an append-only ledger, right? So you can create transactions, you can read it, but you can't edit it and you cannot delete transactions. That is a very important distinction between legacy databases. And what this means is that, again, moving from a current to a distributed ledger framework, again, no reliance on trusted intermediaries for data. In terms of cost, you start to disintermediate your networks. There's a lot of efficiencies that come from it. We're talking about irreversible, cryptographically secure transactions. Settlement time is instant compared to all the intermediaries required for third parties, and it's real-time auditable. So really important to be able to have that real-time recording auditability capability. And again, from integrity, the blockchain becomes a single source of truth. So how does this work though, right? So it's important, and that we mentioned this earlier on, is that there's the underlying protocol and then there's applications and services that run on top of it. So you can see here, and we don't need to go into all this, but there's a lot of the data networking layers that are under the infrastructure that makes a blockchain work. And then you've got lots of different distributed applications and services that run on top of it, to include cryptocurrencies and digital assets. In a very basic, we can take a look at how a transaction can work. So in this case, user A is initiating a transaction to user B. When that transaction is initiated, it is broadcasted to all those nodes. Remember, we described that there are distributed nodes globally, right? And when it's broadcast, one of the nodes will then be either rewarded, or will maybe through a round robin will be selected to process that transaction and validate that it is indeed the correct next transaction. Once that transaction is confirmed, it's unified as the next block of data on that chain of blocks. Once that's added, then it's broadcast and distributed and synchronized across all the nodes, and the transaction is complete. So that's in a very simplified format. This is how it works. And when we talk about transactional layers, it's important to think about what those transactions are. And again, on a simplistic level, layer one, we're talking about a peer-to-peer transaction. This was the first common use case. We're talking about financial transactions, and Bitcoin obviously was very popular. That can be one example of a type of transaction that happens on a blockchain. The next one, again, can also, again, be a peer-to-peer transaction, but it's not talking about cash or currency. It could be, in this example, we're talking about perhaps you're having a conversation between you and your doctor, and you have mutual consent on your prescription or taking a prescription. That consent can also be a type of transaction that's recorded on the blockchain. And then as we go even deeper, one of the most powerful solutions is when you're sort of self-transacting, right? So it's not peer-to-peer anymore. Maybe you're casting a vote and that's recorded as a transaction, or maybe we're talking about an IoT device that's recording a particular event that's a critical tracking event that's then going to be recorded on the blockchain. So just give you a sense that when we talk about blockchain, it's not just about currency and money. There's many types of different transactional layers that can be recorded on a blockchain. And very important is, are all blockchains the same, right? And this is definitely not the case. We highlight this slide basically because there's so much, obviously I'm very biased and bullish on blockchain, but there are certain challenges that are still associated with the technology. And you can see here, this is a 2018 slide from the World Economic Forum, that there are various considerations still out there about how to truly adopt and accelerate blockchain technology. And I would point out the two main ones that you hear probably quite often is the scalability, the level of scalability of the technology, and again, the amount of carbon footprint or sustainability of the technology. These are two things that are quite recurring. And so when you're evaluating blockchain technology for any blockchain, you will have to be confronted by what we call this blockchain trilemma. Okay, so for any blockchain, you're really trying to view the struggle or the tension between three variables. One is security, one is the level of decentralization of that blockchain, and the scalability. So nobody's going to compromise on security, right? So it really boils down to, depending on how that blockchain is set up, its consensus, how it adds that next block will determine the level of decentralization or how scalable that blockchain is. Okay, so these are three things to keep in mind when you're evaluating blockchain technology. And this can give you an example of just how it differs across different protocols. You know, I obviously come from the perspective of the Go chain, blockchain, enterprise grade, highly scalable, and you can see there the impact of transactions per second, the average cost per transaction, and this varies a lot, again, depending on how blockchains reach consensus and add that next block, and the latency. So, you know, Go chain, for example, we're averaging 3 to 5 seconds per transaction. And there's lots of different terminology and jargon that you're going to hear about blockchains. It's not important to know these specifically, again, just to be able to ask the question. One is that, you know, when we're talking about, for example, say public or private, you know, who can participate in the blockchain, right? Is it public, you know, or is it more of a permission environment where a private environment that you can only be able to participate if you're invited? And when we're talking about, for example, say an open or closed blockchain, you know, who can view the transactions, and then getting down to it in terms of permission or permissionless, you know, what are the rights? Are all participants treated the same, or is there an administrator that's responsible for giving different layers of access and responsibilities within that blockchain? So there are lots of different attributes associated with the blockchain. It really just depends on the protocol and the use case. So let's talk about applications. So, you know, I think today, and as I mentioned earlier, there's so many different use cases out there for how we're using blockchain technology, and we highlight and summarize a few here. But, you know, food safety is a big one, right? Because if you have a distributed ledger that's real-time recording transactions that are, you know, auditable on a blockchain, that becomes highly compelling when you're talking about the tracking of food and food security, outbreaks. These kind of things is really huge, and of course, particularly on compliance for any regulation that's out there right now, to be able to audit a real-time posted transaction is really compelling for compliance purposes. And again, just agriculture in general, agri-foods, just understanding the provenance of the products that you're consuming, whatever claims are being made, can you substantiate those claims through the agriculture supply chain? And of course, you know, I think every major enterprise right now is pursuing some level of sustainability or ESG path to net zero requirement. All of that closely related to is how you report that carbon footprint and your greenhouse gas emissions. Again, blockchain becomes highly compelling to be able to record those transactions in terms of how you're substantiating your reporting. Lots of legislation coming out right now in terms of ethical sourcing to make sure that you're responsibly sourcing your raw material inputs in your products in your supply chain. And you know, in terms of measurement of your scope 1, scope 3 emissions, understanding all of that throughout the supply chain, you need to have something that you can trust to have high fidelity data and record that on an immutable ledger. And again, product authenticity is something that we all continue to be very frustrated with across industries, and again, being able to better authenticate that the product is real, its value chain, its sourcing, its provenance, all of that can be done through the blockchain. I mentioned compliance because there's just been a tremendous uptick in legislation and regulation across the board, from illegal, unregulated, unreported activities in the supply chain, human trafficking, unethical slave labor, and food security rights. That the Food Safety Modernization Act, Section 204D, for example, the requirements for digital traceability, forwards, backwards traceability and responsiveness in supply chains for certain products. That's going to be very important, and blockchain is highly compelling for that. But yeah, you can see here there's lots of different legislation that is coming out centered around supply chains, and blockchain can be very important to help you record and substantiate the claims that you're making in your supply chain. Agriculture, again, touched on it in terms of product provenance, quality and freshness, your logistics, and all the stakeholders in your supply chain, and where can we find automation and operational efficiencies that works very well with blockchains. We talk about greenhouse gas emissions and your path to net zero and your carbon footprint, and the reporting that's required and associated with these claims. All that requires high integrity data, and again, being able to timestamp those transactions on a blockchain. We mentioned ethical sourcing, humane treatment. There's lots of ways, lots of really creative ways right now that organizations are thinking about for that first mile, how to better authenticate that you are responsibly sourcing products. And authenticity, as I highlighted, what you see on your screen here there's been so many questions around authenticity. When you're talking about food, it could be olive oil, it could be honey, saffron. Seafood fraud, there's statistics that 30 to 70% of seafood in the United States, it's either mislabeled or just fraudulently claimed. So there's a lot of fraud out there. And again, blockchain helps to ensure that you have the transparent and responsible supply chains to make the claims around your products. And at the end of the day, you just want to have granular end-to-end traceability, right? Throughout your entire supply chain, every chain of custody, critical tracking event, key data elements, all of that to be able to be timestamped, real-time timestamped and recorded on a blockchain. And all of that has implications in terms of regulations, compliance, how you're reporting, and to your carbon footprint and your greenhouse gas emissions. So with that backdrop in mind, hopefully that gives you a bit of a foundation or to be able to evaluate blockchain as you consider deployment and rolling it out in your supply chains. So let's talk about blockchain readiness. So just to get started, typically we have a lot of questions, why blockchain? And we addressed a little bit of that on this session today in terms of a distributed ledger technology versus legacy centralized architecture. But do you really even need to understand the blockchain to get started? No, you don't. There's a lot of applications out there now today that in terms of an interface and user experience to be able to quickly adopt blockchain. And very important, is it affordable? And that depends really on the distributed ledger technology that you will be deploying. So when you consider a blockchain, there's a variety of different issues there. We discussed that blockchain trilemma, right? So if you don't have a scalable blockchain, not only is it not scalable and enterprise friendly, but there can be a considerable cost element, both in transactional costs as well as the environmental costs as well. And are there any additional, expenses required in terms of software and hardware? And how does this impact my current system, my legacy system? Will it be compatible with vendor software, third-party software, and again, with my existing infrastructure? These are all the kind of questions. And more important, how is this data stored, right? Do I need a whole new data lake for blockchain, or can I keep everything the same? These are the kind of things that questions that are typically raised. And I think at a high level, we can boil that down into 4 different steps here in terms of supply chain mapping, the particular tagging related or identification of the assets or commodities that you want to track, the integrations question, and also ultimately the impact on workflow. So let's talk about supply chain mapping. So at the very beginning, it's important to understand exactly what the objectives are for your track and trace. And we highlighted some of the use cases and examples of why you really need to start deploying this type of technology to substantiate your claims and to record transactions on an immutable ledger. And part of this question then is, what data exactly is going to be on chain? So because blockchain is permanent, right? So you wouldn't really have any personally identifiable information, things like that on a blockchain. What's on there is essentially what they call sort of a digital hash. It's a unique signature, cryptographic signature that's recorded on the blockchain. And but maybe what that represents are timestamps, geo coordinates, as you can imagine, chain of custody for your supply chain. But again, as you are thinking about the product that's being tracked and traced, at the most basic level, maybe it's a particular unit, like say a lobster, which will not undergo any transformation. But maybe it's a carton, right, or a container. Maybe you're talking about a box, you're talking about a truck, but really understanding what exactly is being traced to help substantiate your claims. And then when you're deploying blockchain technology, how will that be able to be used and deployed to all the stakeholders throughout your supply chain? And again, as I mentioned, very important to understand what is the data, the essential data that needs to be recorded on chain. Tagging requirements. So, when you think about a blockchain, you're essentially having almost like a digital twin of a particular physical asset on the blockchain to be tracked and traced. So to do that, you need to have some tagging element. So typically there's probably, already a GS1 barcode, or maybe you're using QR codes, but maybe you need RFID or IoT, you need some other unique tagging elements. But these are all things that need to be determined in order to be able to give that unique identity to be represented on a distributed ledger. And obviously, depending on the industry or sector, there's some very obvious ones in terms of tagging elements, but at the most basic level, you're probably talking about barcodes and QR codes. And systems integration, very, very closely associated to tagging. So is there IoT, data collection, sensor devices that are part of your supply chain? How is that going to be integrated and capture important data on your blockchain? Beyond that, in terms of systems, maybe you're integrating through APIs with other third-party vendors that are also important to the data that's flowing through your supply chain. So all of that can also be real-time recorded and timestamped on the blockchain. So that's obviously, as the supply chains get more complex and there's more stakeholders, then the integrations will be increasingly more important. But perhaps at that first mile, when you have a fairly linear supply chain, you may not have as many integration or IoT requirements. And ultimately, workflow. So there's definitely time required to understand how to improve the data integrity for your transactions. So when you look at it, are there commingling of assets, things like that? These have to be addressed because as we've seen time and time again, as products are flowing through the supply chain, there is a question of how these assets should be separated to better ensure the sort of data hygiene that's actually being posted on the blockchain. I wanted to highlight GoTrace to give you an example of how easy you can deploy blockchain traceability today. So GoTrace is a turnkey modular blockchain traceability application. It enables you to real-time timestamp and record key data elements, critical tracking events, and any other metadata that needs to be recorded on a public ledger. It's a mobile-first, zero-paper, all-digital solution, so it's highly sustainable. And really important is that it's hardware, software, and cloud agnostic. So when you're thinking about blockchain traceability, that total cost of ownership, you want to make sure that you're not paying extra for cloud or other software. It really should be all about the blockchain traceability application. And the system itself, it's out-of-the-box solution is QR codes, unique QR codes, but it can be paired, as I mentioned, with any other tagging or ID system to give you that representation on the blockchain. And it can certainly incorporate mobile devices and any kind of sensors, RFID and IoT. And the application itself is already integrated with more than 30+ different logistics and enterprise service providers. And what you get essentially are what we call the breadcrumbs, all the granular track and trace critical tracking events on the blockchain. So you can see here timestamps, geo coordinates, and other metadata that you might think important. All of that can be captured on a real-time basis on a public blockchain ledger. GoTrace runs on the GoChain protocol. So it is a highly scalable and green protocol. So we're talking about 1,300 transactions per second. That's 100x in magnitude compared to, say, Ethereum. It's near frictionless in cost. So it's typically on average less than a penny per transaction. And as I mentioned, really, really green compared with some of the other protocols out there. We're averaging essentially about 55 metric tons of carbon, which is the equivalent of powering 10 homes. And I can tell you that there's a lot of other protocols out there that are significantly more energy and carbon intensive. And we are able to do this through what we call proof of reputation, which is a novel consensus mechanism. And again, we discussed this other. Consensus is how you add that next block to the blockchain. And you can see here it's anchored by a consortium of highly reputable entities to be able to not only have the efficiency, but to have the confidence and trust to know how your transactions and your data is being handled. And what that means at the end of the day is we go from that legacy centralized architecture solution to one that's all digital. You have the single source of truth, don't need to require trust in a lot of intermediaries for that data, and it's highly scalable, fast, and of course the transactions are being real-time recorded and audible on a public ledger, and creates all sorts of new opportunities for business models given the high speed and the low cost for this particular blockchain solution. So, and again, all you need to get started, as I mentioned, it's turnkey, is a mobile phone and access to a printer to print out QR codes. So this is the important takeaway here, is that there is not really a high threshold to get started, right? Today, all you need, you've got, as it's mentioned, mobile phone and access to a printer. These are basically a subscription-based service. So you can get started. It's really more about how to get started, and hopefully we've given you a little bit ways to consider that this morning. And GoTrace is already being used through multiple different industries, as I summarize here. Again, it's turnkey and sector agnostic. So that's it. I think we've captured and rolled through that in about 30 minutes, and I just kind of want to open this up now for Q&A.
Terrific, Henry. What a masterclass on the blockchain. I think that excellent coverage, because so much of it today, you know, people are talking about applications of blockchain, and I think the fundamentals are missed. And you did such a great job in covering those fundamentals. So we really appreciate that. So I encourage the audience to ask questions to Henry, and you know, they are relevant again to your context. One of the items that has come up while you're presenting has to do with just the maturity of the technology, the blockchain technology. It seems that, you know, it's been around now for a while, but as you presented, there are different versions of the technology, and there are different levels maybe of the maturity and development. So if you could talk just, you know, as an overview of the blockchain technology development, if you will, what has been going on maybe in the last year or so? What has, if anything?
Yeah, so this is really important, is that the technology itself is very sound, and it's been around for a while now, right? When we hear breaches or things like that, that's typically associated with centralized exchanges, okay? So that's really more on the, say, the cryptocurrency side. When you're going to a centralized exchange, it's not the underlying protocol itself. There are instances where there have been some security issues, but it's not that often. And again, most of the times we hear about this, it's really more on the exchange level or the application layer, not the underlying protocol. What most has been happening, I would say, in recent years is various projects tackling the scalability problem. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to have mainstream adoption and really use this technology if it's not enterprise friendly, right? So that's been a big issue. There's been other so-called layer 2 solutions. So being able to have additional, say, side chains or other ways in which you can roll up scale transactions faster before recording that on the, we call this the layer 1 protocol. And so there's a lot of ways that people are trying to tackle scalability. That's been the big one. And so remember, so when you go back and you evaluate these blockchains, you kind of think about that blockchain trilemma. You know, are you going to, if it's very decentralized, that makes it very, very secure, but then in all likelihood, you're going to have a very low scalability solution. So this is really the trade-off. It's a trade-off that enterprises or organizations have to make depending on the particular use case. And so what that means is, probably in recent years, there's been just a lot of piloting to try to understand it. But as it starts to roll out, then you start talking about scalability and cost, and you realize there may be some serious limitations with the protocol you're using. So then a lot of there's been some pivoting away from certain protocols that are more scalable and economically and environmentally friendly. So and that's really the other piece too, because we talk about this notion of consensus and how we process these transactions. If you're ESG focused and your protocol is not ESG friendly, all of a sudden you have to reevaluate how to use that technology in addition to the cost and scalability element. So I would say these are really the two big ones, has been scalability and that sort of carbon footprint associated with some of these blockchain protocols. Very
good. And for those organizations that have not started with blockchain, what type of capabilities they should develop internally? to have it, to maintain it appropriately. Of course, you have just shown here an application and an approach with the mobile app that you share that seems very intuitive and easy to use. But tell us about the good, the bad, and the ugly. What is when you actually start using this thing, what are some of the things that you need to prepare yourself for? It would be a good thing to have this skill set, in-house. What does that look like?
Yeah, no, really important question, because there is this notion that perhaps you need to have in-house talent associated with blockchain, or maybe you need some costly consultants, things like that. You really don't. It's evolved to a point now where it can be deployed. And I'll underscore this by saying, for example, when we talk about GoTrace, we have small scale, say, fishers and farmers that are using this application today. It's in multiple languages. It's the idea that if you really want to connect the dots in the supply chain, everybody has to be able to participate, right? So this kind of a platform solution, for example, we've got small scale harvesters, producers, all the way to multinational publicly traded companies. And that's the point, is that the application can be easily configured. You don't actually want to think about the blockchain. You shouldn't have to think about it. As much like we use the internet today, you're not thinking about HTML or the underlying technology of it. But it is ready to be used. I would say, if depending on the use case, there are still some complexities associated. For example, if you talk about cryptocurrencies and custody of wallets and these kind of things, there are some real UI UX challenges. But if you're just talking about enterprise supply chain traceability, there are software out there today, applications that can be deployed. And as I mentioned in this case, if you've got a mobile device, you're ready to go. You literally would just sign up for a subscription today. You could have blockchain traceability today. That would be that easy. I would say the greater challenge is really about how much control or leverage you have throughout your supply chain, because at the end of the day, you really want all of your key stakeholders to still use the application, right? So you may want to, and you may want to create transparency in your own segment that you have control in, but upstream, downstream, you may not have that. And so ideally, you have some partners or stakeholders that have leverage and influence that can help to really educate and help your stakeholders understand why it's important to use blockchain traceability and the benefits. And the benefits could be not only transparency, it could be improved ROI. Frankly, we've got customers that have higher profitability as a result of using blockchain technology. So, and again, as mentioned, there's compliance and substantiating claims. You just Google it. There's plenty of lawsuits out there right now, particularly around greenwashing, blue washing, right? You have to be able to substantiate your claims today. Consumers demand it. So this kind of technology really helps you to do that.
That's very good. That's very helpful. I have a question from Karen Kirby, who first says, great presentation, Ines, and a great overview of blockchain. Thank you for that. And she asks, how do companies navigate the requirements to participate in multiple blockchains across the chain of custody of a supply chain?
Yeah, super important question, because that, I would say, is another issue that keeps being raised, because we hear also from clients and companies that say, well, I don't want to, like, no pun intended, but I don't want to chain myself to one particular chain, right? And if I'm a consumer and I scan a QR code, I don't care what blockchain it's running on. So in the future, there's a lot of efforts undergoing in the industry now about interoperability. So maybe in the future, I scan this particular product, consumer packaged good, maybe it goes across 3 or 4 different protocols. The consumer won't care, right? Your end user is not going to care. And I would say the industry is actively working to do that right now too. And there are some solutions out there already to be able to harness multi-chains through the supply chain. So I would say, for now, as companies are starting to roll it out, it's a really, again, taking this morning, just this basic fundamental primer to start to understand, how scalable is the solution, right? And what is the cost associated, carbon? How does it align with your strategic goals? And then from there, you can start to roll it out. And you'll find, for example, if you're dealing with a permissioned or private environment, all of a sudden you might need a public facing element, right? And that might have limitations for being able to properly engage consumers. So you want to look at the different attributes associated with the blockchain protocol that you're using. By the way, you can pilot and test and explore many of them, right? There's no reason why you can't in the beginning pilot and explore. What I like to really encourage is that there's no time to wait. It's ready to pilot and test now. And I would argue that the companies who are doing it are really setting the stage to be leaders in their particular industry.
Very good. Another question that has surfaced has to do with governance. When you work with organizations that are doing it well, and I don't mean just implementation of the technology. It's really kind of the whole thing. It's identifying what are the processes or systems or items that I need to track, and then and then I track and trace them, and then I have certain metrics of performance related to that. So if you think about someone who is doing kind of a good job end to end, what kind of governance do they have? And I mean governance from the standpoint of who are the key influencers in the organization and roles in the organizations that are part of this deployment that you think make the deployment successful?
So I would say that I think there's a reflex to think that, okay, this is just a supply chain play or IT, and it's really what we've been seeing. This is much more on a strategic level. We've been seeing that it's really coming from leadership that's saying that this is a strategic imperative to have this kind of technology, and it covers a variety of reasons beyond just simply supply chain. So you do definitely want to have a champion. We've seen at the table there's definitely a marketing and branding element. Obviously, there's efficiencies in your supply chain around compliance and technical efficiencies. But I think from a strategic standpoint, to use this technology also opens up a lot of doors and really starts to empower companies. And I think look no further than in the past few years in this sort of COVID environment and how supply chains have been really tested. Everyone's looking to see how we can get improvements in the supply chain and much more transparency, which unfortunately, I think legacy solutions, there's a lot of challenges there, right? In terms of reconciling that data, sort of the data hygiene, incompatibility of networks across multiple global supply chains. So those inefficiencies and trying to be responsive to situations and that we're all dealing with now, you need to have that transparency and for example, using smart contracts or the blockchain, automation with the ability to audit on an immutable ledger. That's highly compelling. So
thank you for that, Henry. And from an industry across industries, if we separate, of course, cryptocurrencies, which are probably the most well-known associations that sometimes people make with blockchain, which has its own fallacies, and you talked about that. But if you look across industries, where are you seeing maybe I wouldn't say the best, but the most frequent use cases for application of blockchain? Is it financial services? Is it like product companies for traceability of products and potential recalls? Healthcare? What kind of industries are leading the way with blockchain? And if you can talk maybe about an application or two that they're using.
Sure. So the first one that everyone, of course, got attention was on the financial services side, right? Particularly on payments, because we all know, we've all tried to wire money and try to move money around the globe. It's not only challenging and takes a lot of time, but it's costly, right? I mean, just look at overseas remittances. So that was really the first easy use case, because you run, much more frictionless on a blockchain, near instant settlement, and the efficiencies associated in this intermediation of all the players that is involved in moving currency around. That was an easy one because you get the benefit right away. But I would say, and I believe this to be the case, when you're talking about agriculture and natural resources right now, that's a real big one. To be able to have that provenance of any particular product that you're consuming, because the reality is there's lots of claims that have been being made across all industries, right? And I think we're at a juncture now where it's not okay to just make loose claims. It's not just about marketing anymore, and I think there's a lot of accountability that's happened. I heard this once. I think it was on Bloomberg, I believe, and there was somebody on being interviewed, and they were talking about sort of the global shredding of global trust, right? Well, I think that's right. I think trust is a real big issue right now across all industries, and so there's a lot of accountability now, and you need to use a mosaic of technologies to be able to help you to substantiate those claims. And I think That's highly evident when you're talking about agriculture, cross-border trade of different products. Some of them can be sensitive, right? If you're talking about healthcare, there was a lot of talk about PPEs at a time, the authenticity of products, and then food fraud, right? Food fraud and any other claims associated and compliance associated with the big S for ESG, and then whatever claims you're making around green. All of these things are in question now, right? So I think that's why you see a lot of strategic imperative to start looking at these technologies, and they're now at a point where you can actually deploy them at a really cost-effective basis.
Very well. Henry, one final question here. For those who are interested in pursuing, some initial implementations of blockchain in their organizations and their supply chain, or maybe even more advanced ones, what is the best way for them to reach you and to learn more about what you're doing and how maybe you can support some of their organizations?
Sure. I had my email up. It's and I'll share my screen real fast. You can see my email here. It's HINES@chainparency.com. Yeah, and happy to just be a sounding board to answer questions, and to continue the conversation, the dialogue that we've had this morning. That big part of what we do in the industry really is just about education, to understand that this technology is ready to be deployed, and of course we can look more specifically at the particular company to see how we can more easily deploy it. So happy to have that conversation.
Henry, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and expertise in such an important topic for supply chains, and a great overview and masterclass on blockchains. So we very much appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Henry Ines with a real masterclass on blockchain and its applications, from fundamentals to applications in supply chain. So a wonderful coverage. Again, you can contact him directly. You just got his information. You can also see his contact information on LinkedIn. Just look at the post that we have for the conference under my name, Jose Perez. You can click in there and you see all the speakers for the conference are hyperlinked on the main post, and you can click on that and connect with him via LinkedIn. We are going to be taking a break now. When we come back, we're going to be with a leader from VMware, and this is Nicole Scheffler, who is the enterprise engineering leader for VMware, and she's going to be talking about supply chains and the context of building a culture in a post-pandemic world for great supply chain performance. So she has tremendous industry insights, incredible experiences from startups to Fortune organizations, and you do not want to miss Nicole's session. And I'll see you with Nicole at the top of the hour again. Thank you.